Hey, podcast listeners. Welcome to another week of the Joanna Whaley podcast. I'm so happy you are here, and we are starting a brand new 2-week series called Out of My Head. And it's all themed off of a brand new song that I'm releasing on June 1st. And I'm excited for you to hear it. You're going to hear that song throughout the podcast today. But before we get started, if you're somebody who needs support, if you're somebody who says, hey, I'm in the closet, or I'm LGBTQ and I have spiritual questions and need spiritual community, you can join us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Joanna Whaley. That's patreon.com/Joanna Whaley. We're kicking off week 1 of a 2-week series called Out of My Head. Let's get it started with some questions on the other side of the music.
Get it out of my head. Can't get it out of my head. I will never be straight, but you say I'll be great if it's out of my head. I was taught I know the truth.
Hey, podcast listeners. Oh man, am I excited that you are here today. I am so excited. We're doing week number 2 of this kind of crazy thing that I've been doing here on this podcast, is having live questions on the show. And I have right now TikTok Live. I have a whole bunch of people, hi friends, on TikTok Live listening. And anytime I record the podcast, I go live and you can ask questions. And today we are talking about conversion therapy. The song you're hearing in the background, for those listening to the podcast right now, this is a new song that I released, and it's all about my experiences as someone who is going through conversion therapy. And I want to be talking all about conversion therapy on the second half of the show. But what we're going to do in a moment is start talking about and asking questions and having people ask questions about conversion therapy. And we're going to kick this off right away with the phones. People actually call this podcast, if you can believe it. And throughout this next few moments, we're gonna have people asking questions in our live chat. I see some people who see me on other podcasts. I've also been a part of other podcasts called Audience of None, with my good friends Joshua and Stephanie. But yeah, so today we're gonna kick off our Q&A time with a question. And why don't we just go right to the phone and listen real quick? Here we go.
Hi, this is Eileen Ryan. Hi, Joanna. You asked for questions relating to the Holy Spirit and queer people. My question is, in many indigenous cultures throughout the world, queer people are thought to have special gifts of various sorts, or maybe to be like gatekeepers between the physical world and the spiritual.
Happy that question was asked. That was last week's question. Hilarious. But I'm glad that it ended up in my queue again today. Here's why. I did some research. I answered this question last week on the show, but I was blanking on there's a people group in India called the Hijra. That's the name that escaped me last week. Yes, in some cultures, it is widely seen that people that are gender variant are seen as having a bit more of like a spiritual significance in some areas of society, and that's definitely present in some Indian, like in the nation of India. The Hijra was the group of people I was looking for last week. They're considered kind of their own gender, and so I'm happy that duplicate question made it in today. But what I want to do is actually go to the next question that I was supposed to answer today. Here we go.
Hi there, this is Fiona Ross in West Palm Beach, Florida. And I would just like to share my thoughts on conversion therapy. You know, for me as a transgender person, it feels like conversion therapy is an ongoing therapy in this society that's being performed by unlicensed medical professionals, if you know what I'm saying. I feel like there's such a pressure that's placed upon us, to revert back or change back to, what we were before, what we were born as. But, I just have to tell people that, like, a butterfly doesn't go back to being a caterpillar, right? so that's just my thoughts on that and why it's just such a lame effort. If conversion therapy is what needs to happen, then it's already too late. That's my feelings on the matter. But it's not that you're too late for a bad thing. It's that you're right on time for a great thing. And that's to welcome, transgender people into your life, your circle, your community. That's what we are as transgender advocates. We're the beacon of light and knowledge, trying to cure that misinformation, and just trying to be a good example, I guess. Joanna, you do it way better than I do, so good for you, girl. Have a great day. Bye.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Fiona, for calling. And yeah, it's so true. We have so many, I like how you said, like, it's kind of a lame attempt. And one of the things that is so true about conversion therapy is that it is often done by unlicensed people. Now, there are people that are licensed, but we have to understand, where are those licenses coming from? Where is that training coming from? A lot of Christian therapists are being trained in highly conservative seminaries. And so you're getting theology that's very much against the queer person. And so they could even have the training, but it can be really challenging because that training is coming through such a homophobic, transphobic lens. And so us as queer people, sometimes if we're sitting across somebody, it doesn't matter what the credentials are. You need to look at, where did the credentials come from? Where did the credentials originate from? And so, so I see somebody here saying on the chat, they went through Catholic conversion therapy. I grew up Catholic as well, and the Catholic Church is definitely, I kind of went on a rant about Catholicism recently on one of the shows recently, where I was all excited one week because, the Pope was making comments, but what we saw was that same old bait and switch. It's you're loved, but we're going to pull the rug out from you and then tell you that your existence as a trans person is wrong. And so I hear you, this person who went through that on there. What advice, okay, here's the next question. What advice would you give anyone going through conversion therapy right now? I'm going to go through this a little bit on the podcast, but if you suspect that you are in conversion therapy right now, my biggest advice would be to stop going. Now, that can be hard because you might be in a relationship where you're being forced to go to this therapist for threat of divorce, where you're being threatened that you'll lose your job. But what you need to do is start to understand that you have to get out, and it isn't safe for you. And I think the biggest thing we can do is first avoid conversion therapy right from the beginning, is ask a lot of questions and almost interview therapists before you get it. But if you are in it now, my biggest advice is to get out and report, because it is illegal in some states. And if it is illegal in your state, get out, get your documentation, and report. They have to be reported if it's illegal. And there's lots of names that people will call conversion therapy, and it isn't conversion therapy. We had a question a little earlier from someone in our chat. Her name's Katie, a good friend of mine. She asked the question, Do you think that, if she could put the question in there again, the idea was, should conversion therapy be considered, I believe, abuse of adolescence? And my answer to that is going to be a complicated yes. I think that we live in a culture right now where Christian ideals are sometimes preferred in many municipalities, in many government systems. So look at any of the, this isn't a political podcast, but what I'm saying is that it would be so difficult to get someone to say, hey, this biblical counseling, because what happens now, there's so many different names of it, and we'll go through that later in the show, but it would be so difficult. But I do believe it is definitely psychologically abusive to people. It was for me. And I think that any parent that is purposely and knowingly putting their child through that needs to be addressed. And I don't know what the rules are where you live. I could imagine that in some places, if you knew that this was going on and the practice was illegal, I don't know, maybe that is a CPS thing. I would have, if I wasn't being forced by my parents, but I wish somebody had told me, and it wasn't illegal in Michigan where I live at the time when I was going through it. But if I was going through it now and I knew it was illegal, I would seek out any way I could to get the appropriate actions taken. But yes, I think it is, without like putting a legal name on it, it definitely is abusive, and it needs to be addressed. Someone else says here they love reconstructionism. That I haven't heard it that termed that way, but yes, I think you hear a lot of negativity about deconstruction from the evangelical community. If you're just joining the podcast, if you're just joining the live chat, I was an evangelical pastor for almost 20 years. And when I started to hear the term deconstruction inside of our congregations, every pastor in the room started rolling their eyes. But I think what I was always really impressed with was those who tore it all down in the best ways possible and started to rebuild things for what works for them and what helps their spirit grow. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I love it. But here's the other thing I'll say too, is this whole, like, you have to deconstruct it and burn it down and build it back up. I'm going to say you don't need to. I'm going to say if you burn it down and leave it and piss on the ashes, go for it. Like that's totally valid as well. So we are at the end of our Q&A time. But if you are watching live, you're listening to the podcast, we have plenty more of the podcast to go. Stick around, as we're going to be diving into some really intense topics today, talking about conversion therapy and how it affects us. We'll be right back after this. Hey, podcast listeners, you can join a group of LGBTQ people exploring faith right now. If you go to patreon.com/Joanna Whaley, you can become part of the community that we are building online. You can have direct talks with me. We can text, we can Zoom, all for just a low monthly amount of $4.99 a month. You can also, if you want to be more nerdy about some of the music and the podcast recording background, you can subscribe for $9.99 a month. But what we're doing is building a community of people. Go to patreon.com/Joanna Whaley. That's patreon.com/Joanna Whaley and join the community today. We hope to see you there.
Can't get it out of my head. Can't get it out of my head.
Well, welcome back, friends, to the podcast. How much fun is it? To me, it's a lot of fun. I got used to the buttons. I only had one moment of feedback on the first thing, but I hope you didn't hear it on the finished podcast. But yeah, it's always good to just take questions and listen to people as they are working through some of life's most difficult and challenging questions. And I today, as I'm recording this podcast, I'm only about a week away from the release of a brand new song called Out of My Head, which you just heard at the beginning of this segment. But, I wrote this song about my conversion therapy moment. My moment of conversion therapy started in one of the weirdest ways. In the first segment of the show, I talked about I was an evangelical pastor for 20 years of my life, but as I've talked many times on this show about how when I was about 6, 7, 8 years old, I started to feel on the inside of me that I didn't feel like a boy. And if you're joining us for the first time, I'm a transgender woman, and I started to have these feelings on the inside that I wasn't a boy, that I always felt like a girl on the inside. But then I started attending this hyper-conservative church, but the church was super cool. And the church was so, it had lights and smoke and, pastors in skinny jeans and leather jackets. It was just like this place felt like relevant and felt in the now, and I felt really safe in this church. But when I started to hear the preaching, when I started to hear the pastors and how the pastors would talk about LGBTQ people and talk about trans people, I started to fear for myself. I started to get afraid because the things that they were saying were pure evil in the world were the exact thing I wrestled with in my own life. And I'll never forget the night. It was like a cold night in February. And, crap had hit the fan in my life. And I had felt the moment came that I have to talk to my pastors. These were the people I trusted the most in my life. And they had kind of separated me from my family and those who actually supported me, which is, a key sign of covert narcissism. But anyways, I'll get back to the topic here. But I was in the church, and I text the pastor, said, I have something I've got to talk about. I need to talk about something with you. It's a cold February night. All the lights were off in this church, and it was like an old grocery store was our church. And we had like this coffee shop in our church, and I remember sitting at a table just outside the coffee shop in like the main lobby. All the lights are off. There's like one light on in the whole building, and here I am sitting and talking with my pastors. And in this moment, I said, hey, I am struggling with sin. The word I used was sin. I'm struggling with, quote, sin. And it's, quote, sexual sin. And I remember telling them what I was dealing with. That I was wrestling with my gender. That I never felt like a boy. I always felt like a girl. And that trust that I had built up with my pastors came to a fork in the road. But I didn't realize that I was about to walk down a path that was going to harm me in the most difficult way, in the most challenging way I had ever experienced. It was in this moment that it seemed like the love from my pastors were wrapping around me. They were like wrapping their arms. They're like, listen, we're going to get you through this. We're going to pay for this. We know a therapy center that specializes in this. And I remember, and I'm going to name names. It's called Reconciliation Ministries. And here I go with a check from my church to pay for the first session. And I'm driving to Detroit, which is where this therapy was at. And I pull up to this church that's like completely closed down. It's like there's none of the doors are open, all the lights are off. I'm like, is this the right place? And I remember talking to the guy through email. He said it's going to look like the church is closed, but I promise go to this door and you'll get in. So I get there. I park in the parking lot, this dingy church, and I started to get afraid. As I walk inside this dark, dingy room and the stairs go down. You know, like in high school where like the kids who smoked all the time, they like would sneak behind the back of the high school down those stairs and like that's where they would like smoke secretly. That was like the entrance to this place. So here I am. I'm like walking down these stairs. I come in and I sit down at this like old school desk. It's like one of those like a half desk with like one side where you can like write, and I'm sitting in this hallway and there's one of those white noise machines in the hall so that you can't hear what's going on in the office. And then I hear some people laughing and they leave the room, and I kind of duck my head a little bit because I don't want them to see me. Because who knows? Maybe they attend my church. I was pastoring in a large church, and the counselor says, "Come on in." So I come in. The lights are super dim. It's kind of like a little bit disorienting when I get in there. And there's books everywhere. You know, there's degrees on the wall. So I'm thinking, well, of course this is legit, right? Of course, like this person knows what they're talking about. The therapist for the next couple of minutes kind of went through his credentials and then went through the ministry's credentials and what they do and how they do what they do and why they do what they do. And I'm sitting there on this brown couch, hugging a pillow because I was nervous, didn't know what to do, and just nodding my head and hearing all the credentials and thinking, well, I guess because of what you've done, because of everything you've told me you're good at, and you've told me the success you've had, I guess I trust you. So what this ministry specialized in was sexual immorality for pastors. They only ministered to pastors who had like sexual immorality issues. And so here I am, because I confessed that I like to wear women's clothes. I'm sitting there telling them all about it. So the therapist, after all of his credentials are laid out, and I am like, well, you have all the licenses, so I should just trust you blindly. I start telling the therapist what my struggles were. And some of the things that I said, I remember saying, I have this fetish to wear women's clothes. I like to cross-dress, is how I framed it to the pastor or to this therapist, because that's what I was told being trans was. It's just men who like to cross-dress and their sexual deviance. So that's what I thought my problem was. And so me having that lens and my pastors telling me, like trans people, like these trans women out there, they are just sexual deviants who want to cross-dress. And that's your problem. That's what you're struggling with. They told me what my problem was. So that's how I framed it to the conversion therapist. Now, of course, they don't call themselves conversion therapists. They're biblical counselors. But there I am. I'm telling them all about these struggles, about how when I'm home alone, I put on women's clothes, and I go on Amazon and I buy women's clothes, and then I immediately feel guilty. And then they went through the cycle of guilt and and they tried to tell me that I had an addiction to this. They had said that they were equating it to an addiction and starting to use AA tactics on me, saying, okay, well, you're in the cycle of addiction. So like once you start feeling guilty, you throw it all away. You get rid of everything, and then you do fine for a minute, and then you come right back to it. It's a circle, and it is treated like an addiction. So right away in this conversion therapy session, the wrong diagnosis was being given. But what happened is, after I told my story and after I told them what I was wrestling with, they told me how they were going to fix me. They told me the end goal, which, if you've heard me talk about this before on this podcast, that is terrible therapy. They said, here's the goal. We're going to get you from where you are right now to healed of this sin. And they started telling me about all the success they've had, and I just believed them. I believed about myself what they were telling me. You see, many people go through this counseling, and I'm using the word counseling like with the biggest air quotes in the world. Thousands upon thousands of people are taught that these things about themselves are wrong and they have to be changed in order to be loved by God. Thousands of people go through this, and it's still happening today. Conversion therapy steals your agency. It steals the control of your life from you by saying that we were never in control in the first place. It takes your agency and says, you are not in control anymore. You can't control yourself anymore. You're going to give these things to God and let God heal you. But what that language is saying is that we are going to take your agency from you. And what happens in conversion therapy is the exact opposite of what's preached on stage every week. I used to sing songs in church, and we used to say, I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. But what conversion therapy does to you is it fills you with fear. It's a fear of messing up. It's a fear that around every corner, there's some picture, there's some girl wearing that thing you think is cute out there, and the devil is trying to get you to sin, and it puts you in a state of fear at all times of your life. I mean, all over the U.S. right now, there are states outlawing this. In the state where I live, which is in Michigan, conversion therapy is officially illegal. But the problem comes is that churches have misused the scripture of saying that they're going to be as wise as serpents. They're going to be as crafty as a serpent. And they're going to be wise as they try to maneuver through the laws. They've just changed the name of conversion therapy, friends. It's still happening. So if you hear somebody say they're seeing a biblical counselor, if you're seeing a biblical counselor, you're in conversion therapy. If you're in something called reparative therapy, that is conversion therapy. Even pastoral counseling can be conversion therapy if sexual orientation or gender identity is the point of the counsel. Conversion therapy is still happening, and it is illegal in most states in the US. According to the Human Rights Campaign, people who are in conversion therapy are 6 times as likely to die by suicide. 6 times. And this is from the Human Rights Campaign. This isn't just some made-up statistic. So what do we do? What do we do when passages of the Bible are misused against us? One of the passages I want to look at today is a commonly misused Bible passage to get people to stay in the closet and to put themselves through something like conversion therapy. It's Romans 1:26. It says this: "For this reason God gave them over to dishonorable passions. Females exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. In the same way, also males gave up natural intercourse with females, while were consumed with passionate desires for one another. Males committed shameless acts with males and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error." This is a commonly misused scripture to tell queer people to get back in the closet. But what I want to do, I want to look at 3 parts of this together today. The first thing I want to talk about is dishonor. This is kind of the concept that was thrown at me, is you don't want to be dishonorable. But in biblical times, it was a pivotal social issue in the New Testament world among Romans and Greeks and Jews. Honor was a pivotal thing. It was considered a significant thing to have honorable status in society. And people did whatever they did to avoid the perception of shame. Shame in the Roman world, like in the Greco-Roman world, those who were labeled as shameful it wasn't just somebody that was embarrassed by something. No. It was your whole identity in the culture. And you lost out on everything if that label fell on you. Paul in Thessalonians, he says that, Christians, although they are not honored in the eyes of the world, they were honored in the eyes of God. Paul, even though I have problems with Paul in the Bible, gives kind of this idea that look, you can rise above this idea of shame and honor with faith, with spirituality. And that was what Paul was saying here. There's been some studies. Psychologists have studied cognitive factors that lead to severe anxiety and doubts associated with things like OCD. And a lot of times we're talking about this fear, and this fear of losing honor is really used against people in Christianity. And listen to this. Psychologists study 3 things that lead into anxiety, and these are weapons used by religion many times. The first one is exaggerated estimates regarding the probability of harm. People are told if they come out that they're going to be ruining their whole life, that they're going to be ruining their honor and their shame, and they're going to be shamed. They're not going to be respected pastors anymore if they come out, if they're gay. Control is something that if you lose control, that can lead to anxiety, and depression, and intolerance of uncertainty. Christianity today has become so obsessed with being certain of everything. There's no mystery anymore in the faith. Reverend Elizabeth Edman said this. She said, the queer experience points out the terror of love as love. Rule breaking is one of the most common fears among Christians today. Christian ethics lays out a series of rules that assume that God would condemn us if we were to violate them. Christian sexual ethic has conformed people to follow rules rather than their own nature. It's an amazing thing to think that we have been forcing people out of their nature. And that's the next thing I want to look at, is forcing people against their nature is never okay. It's never okay. Karl Heinrich Ulrich in 1868 wrote, he cannot, speaking of the homosexual, okay, the language was pretty terrible back then, but he said, speaking of the homosexual, he said, he cannot act differently. He did not give himself this love direction, and he cannot eliminate it either. Karl Heinrich Ulrich, he was cast out from everything, his job, his town, his family, just for voicing that if you're LGBTQ, it's part of your inherent nature. In the 40s and the 50s, 1940s and 50s, there was these scientific studies by a sexologist named Alfred Kinsey. And Kinsey conducted these two major research projects of human sexuality. And it's important to know that it was illegal to be gay in the UK and in the US at that time. But Kinsey the results of this, he said, first is that biological genitalia does not equate to sexuality. And if you put that in a modern context, that's, genitalia doesn't determine your gender. It just determines your biology. And he said, secondly, sexuality is not limited to binary hetero and homosexual activity. He said it's far more of a continuum. And despite his work and this report in the 1940s and 50s, the Christian church took the ball and they ran with conversion therapy, thinking that they could cure the, quote, illness of homosexuality. Conversion therapy just continued to get more and more popular. But I think we need to take a look at, why do we think that we have to cure people? Why do we think that it's not natural to be queer? And I think it all comes from this idea of original sin. I'm going to get in trouble with my evangelical friends right now, because I'm a queer theologian. If you're listening to my podcast, if you're watching online, I'm a queer theologian, and I'm coming from that lens. But I do not believe in original sin. I do not believe you were born bad. And we need to start climbing out of this hole of original sin that we have designed for ourselves. And we need to take up a much more positive anthropological view of humanity and ourselves. We need to be much more generous with ourselves. Richard Rohr, a Catholic theologian, he's kind of like the father of progressive theology. He's a Catholic priest. He says that he's never met a truly compassionate or loving human being who did not have a foundational or even deep trust in the inherent goodness of human nature. I love that. Look, we need to understand that shameless love is not sin. We need to be able to look at two adults who are a gay couple, who are in a committed, loving relationship. If that's where if you need marriage to be that way, if you need it to be between two committed people, if it's shameless, it's not sin. And we'll get into a whole podcast eventually about what is sin, but it's not sin if you have two loving, consenting adults. And I'm even going to go out as far as say this. I have many friends who are in the poly community, and they're in couples of 3 or 4, that they have larger circles of love, but they're all like loving, amazing relationships. And there's no shame there. I have many poly friends who who are now in healthier places relationship-wise than they've ever been. And I knew some of them. They were married in like monogamous relationships before. But shameless love isn't sin. But many of us in the queer community, we have this internalized shame because we've been told by our religion for so long how terrible we are. And that our sexuality is shameful if it's outside of the context of a man and a woman in marriage. Many, many people in the queer community have been shamed into staying straight when they're actually queer. We need to we need to just remove shame from our world, our society. The Stonewall movement wasn't about anything other than creating pride, and not the pride that many in the Christian community like to say comes before fall. No. Pride in a queer context is about removing shame. And so I want to say, if you're somebody, you're listening to this, you're watching this, and you're in biblical counseling right now, I want to help you get out. Get out. And if it isn't safe for you to get out, stop engaging. If it is not safe for you to get out of your conversion therapy, just stop engaging. Protect yourself. Reach out to me. Go to joannawhaley.com/support and let's talk. Let's see how we can get you help. Let's see how we can make sure that you're safe. Biblical counseling, conversion therapy is not natural. Who you are, as my pastor always says at my church, says who you are, who you love, who loves you, that's your nature. Friends, thank you so much for listening to the show today. This is some heavy stuff. But you were born exactly who you are supposed to be and who you love, even if that means discovering yourself later in life. You're not a problem for God, and you don't need to change a damn thing. This has been a production of Whaley Media. June 1st, my new song called Out of My Head comes out, and I would love for you to take a listen. You're going to hear it at the end of the show here. I'm so happy you joined us. Go to joannawhaley.com/support or go to patreon.com/joannawhaley, and we will see you next week for the release of the song Out of My Head. I'm going into detail about every part of that song and telling some wild stories. You're loved. Be good, friends. We'll see you next week.
Can't get it